Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, I've been getting people out the wazoo asking me to take a look at History Matters' latest video that came out a few days ago. It's called How Close Was the U.S. to Another Civil War in 1876? It's already got 600,000 views, so I figured it was a good time to go ahead and take a look at this one. It's right in our wheelhouse. We're talking about the aftermath of the Civil War, Reconstruction, the 1876 election. I think the short answer is not that close, but I'll be curious to see what they say about this in a little bit deeper dive. It's an 8-minute video, so probably end up 15 to 20 minutes talking about this. I do want to let you know, and I'm not announcing this in a separate video yet. That announcement video will be coming in a few days, but good for you for watching this video because you get a sneak peek at the fact that we have a Scotland trip that is now live for booking. Our patrons and members have had access to it for a couple of days now, and about a third of the spots have already been taken. Actually, a fourth of the spots because we were able to add a couple extra spots on the tour, as it seems like this is going to be a popular one. We're going to Scotland, and I'll be making a full announcement video about this in a couple of days and making it available to the general public, but the link is in the description of this video, so you can check it out now, see the full itinerary. If you have any questions about any of it, let me know. But you put $500 down, you can reserve your spot. We are going to Edinburgh. We're going to some places associated with Robert the Bruce and William Wallace. We're going to Orkney and seeing some great Viking-related stuff. It's going to be a lot of fun. So that's all I'll say about it for now. I'll leave the rest for the video. Let's go ahead and dive into this video from History Matters.
The United States has, in the past, had some hotly contested elections, but only in a few of them did the political temperature run as high as the election of 1876. Which saw the governor of Ohio, Rutherford B. Hayes, victorious and sworn in as president, whereas Samuel J. Tilden, his opponent, had won the popular vote as well as the Electoral College.
So I would disagree a little bit. I always get leery of people saying that they won the popular vote. Well, that's true. It doesn't mean anything. It's like saying you won the football game because you had the most yards. The score is what matters. How many points you have, how many yards you have doesn't matter. It's like saying in soccer and football for the rest of the world, you won the time of possession. Great, you had the ball for 80% of the time, but you still lost 1-0. So it doesn't matter. Winning the popular vote means nothing. You're not running for the popular vote. So, and he didn't, I mean, he arguably won the Electoral College if you say that those states went to him. It was disputed. And I would argue that the fact that in the southern states there was a lot of voter suppression going on of African-American votes who overwhelmingly voted Republican also contributed to this. So any argument you make in favor of Tilden, there are equal if not stronger arguments against Tilden.
Until he hadn't. At this time, anger and resentment at former Civil War opponents was commonplace across the United States, and as the nature of this election's results became clear and how quickly they then changed, many Americans feared that both Hayes and Tilden would simultaneously have themselves inaugurated as president, acts which would then obviously bring the country to the brink of another civil war. But how justified were these fears? How close was the United States to another civil war in the wake of the election of 1876? So as you'll know, the American Civil War ended in 1865 with the defeat of the Confederacy and the end of slavery as an institution. And after this, the victorious US government had the difficult task of reincorporating the defeated states back into the Union. This was done via a process known as Reconstruction.
So I just want to comment and say that if you've seen the Apple TV show Manhunt, at least the animation on this channel did a better job of portraying what Edwin Stanton looks like than Manhunt did. I thought the acting was fantastic by the actor who played Stanton, but he didn't look anything like him. It wasn't that hard to give him a beard that made him look like Stanton. I don't know why they chose not to do that. But Reconstruction is something much like in World War II, where by the time you get to 1944 into 45, even before the war's over, you have the leadership having conferences talking about what the post-war world's going to look like. All the way back in late 1863, the Union is already thinking about what the post-war United States looks like. So they're already thinking about this idea of reconstruction. In other words, how do we put things back together and rebuild the country after this? What do we do with the 4 million people who were formerly enslaved? How do we readmit the southern states to the Union? How, who is allowed to participate in government and who's not? Are we going to consider certain people traitors? Are we going to have trials for people like Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee? Are we going to pardon everybody? Will those former Confederates be allowed to participate in government? All of that has to be considered.
Which was neither popular nor successful. Reconstruction saw the Confederacy divided into occupation zones and run by military governors from the...
A lot like what you saw in World War II. In fact, this is where you could say that the inspiration for a lot of that comes from the occupation zones, the military districts. Guys like Dan Sickles are going to be in command of different military districts in the South. It's going to be all martial law and military governance until they can start readmitting these states.
Union. All slaves within them were freed, and the federal government granted itself much greater authority and power to act within those states. For a state to end this status and rejoin the United States properly, they had to ratify the 14th Amendment, which gave everyone born within the US American citizenship and granted them all equal rights under the law.
So initially you have the 13th Amendment, which ends slavery, but then what was happening was that immediately in the southern states you were starting to see them looking for loopholes around that, right? So you're signing up formerly enslaved people to contracts that can be bought and sold, and they're only getting room and board for their work. And so basically they're enslaved in all but name, and you can't get out of the contract. And so then they're suppressing the right to vote. They're saying, well, yeah, you're free now, but you still aren't a citizen. Dred Scott said you're not a citizen, and Dred Scott decision. And so they have to deal with all of these aftermath things that keep cropping up.
At least in theory. In practice, no. Once they had ratified the 14th Amendment, these southern states were readmitted. 5 seconds after this, many of them passed laws which restricted the rights of black citizens, heavily suppressed their ability to vote, and also turned a blind eye to violence against them.
Yep.
You'd think that this would be a violation of their terms of readmission, which would then come with some consequences, but sad fact, no. The reason that they got away with this was that officially these things weren't done on the basis of race, but instead were based upon things like property ownership and literacy, which were only very heavily correlated with race, which is technically different. Over the next decade, things only got more heated, which brings us to the 1876 election. This came at the end of Ulysses S. Grant's second term as president, who at this point was unpopular due to numerous corruption scandals as well as being seen as out of touch with the average American.
And understand, too, that by this point, people in the North have had 4 years of the American Civil War. They've now had 11 years of Reconstruction. You've got a Sioux War going on out west where you just had Custer and part of his command wiped out. People are just tired of war and tired of fighting, and they're tired of Reconstruction, and they want it to be over. And that plays into all of this. It really does. The Republicans have run the show for the better part of a decade and a half now. They're just ready for something to change.
Knowledge of this led to the Republicans nominating the more moderate Rutherford B. Hayes, who wanted reconciliation with the South, whereas the Democrats chose Samuel J. Tilden, whose being the governor of New York was hoped could swing the state away from the Republicans, and his economic policies were well liked in the South, many of whose white residents just wanted the Republicans out of office and the end of Reconstruction. The election was a close one, and because information travelled somewhat slowly, each party was mostly working with estimates. The next day, the Democrats proclaimed that Tilden had won the popular vote as well as all of these states, thereby giving him 203 electoral votes, well over the 185 he needed to win. However, the Republicans claimed that in fact Hayes had actually won all of these states, and the only one which was too close to call was Florida, thereby giving Hayes 181 electoral votes to Tilden's 184, with Florida's 4 votes still in play. It won't surprise.
Well, I'm sure we have never heard about a close election coming down to Florida before, right? And once you start getting into voter suppression, as I said at the beginning, there are a lot of serious questions about how fair the election results were in these southern states to begin with.
I you to learn that after this, things became quite tense because there were some irregularities that occurred in these 3 states during the vote. In both Louisiana and Florida, violence and fraud had been a big issue.
Especially in Louisiana. Look at some of the stuff that happened during Reconstruction and the years after the Civil War. Riots, massive amounts of black citizens being killed. It was brutal because think about it. During this and before the Civil War, these enslaved people were viewed as property, which meant to your average racist Southerner, I'm not saying all Southerners were racist, but to your average racist Southerner, they had value. Now that they're no longer enslaved, they have no value. So where they might have been protected while they were considered property, now they have no protection.
See, unlike the modern day, there wasn't any standardization of ballots or methods of voting. And in these two states, votes were often cast by posting pre-printed party ballots.
Yep.
And the ballots used by the Democrats had been intentionally designed to look like Republican ones, which was believed to have tricked some illiterate voters, i.e. many of them, into voting for the wrong party. Whereas South Carolina had managed the impressive feat of casting more votes than the stated eligible voters. As such, the still
Gee, I wonder if there was anything irregular about that. More people voted than could vote.
in charge but probably not for much longer Republican-run state governments within these states quickly removed the votes that they considered ineligible, i.e. the ones for the Democrats, and Hayes was soon given these three states and therefore the presidency. Obviously, this swift change was going to cause some resentment amongst the people, hence why the president-elect was soon given the nickname Rutherford B. Hayes by his opponent. Now normally it would fall to the vice president as head of the Senate to certify the election, but one, he was too busy being dead, and two, the man who had replaced him as head of the Senate was a Republican and no Democrat would accept his verdict. Furthermore,
if you think that petty partisan stuff like what we're seeing right now is new, it's not at all.
the Democrats argued that as the party in control of the House of Representatives under the 12th Amendment, it was up to them to choose the next president, which of course the Republicans were not okay with. Things were looking pretty bad, but guess what though, the 1876 election wasn't done. You see, Tilden wasn't a dummy, and he and his team knew that the Republicans would argue that the federal government had no jurisdiction to override the changed results that a state returned for the election. And so the Democrats got the governor of Oregon, an ally of Tilden, to replace one of the Republican Electoral College voters with the Democrat, who then voted for Tilden even though Oregon had swung for Hayes, thereby giving him one vote that he needed for victory. It was at this point that people started to get really angry and talk of a civil war began in earnest. The incumbent President Grant ordered thousands of troops to take up positions in and around Washington, D.C. to protect Hayes during the transition of power.
Remember, Grant's a military guy first and foremost, and so that's the first thing he's going to think to do. The government at this point has thousands of Union troops in the South to enforce Reconstruction. That's coming to an end, so the troops are out there and they're available.
Hayes' swearing-in ceremony was also secretly moved forward by a day and privately into the White House. And furthermore, Democrats were also banned from the later public ceremony to prevent any potential incidents. Whereas on Tilden's behalf, numerous governors offered to call up state militias to fight for Tilden's presidency. And these divides weren't simply across previous Confederate Union lines either. Union General George B. McClellan was gathering soldiers in veteran societies and speaking to former Confederate leaders in case armed conflict should break out. And some of Tilden's supporters also planned to set up their own inauguration in New York to challenge Hayes.
Remember, McClellan's a Democrat. He's eventually going to be elected the governor of New Jersey. Ran against Lincoln in 1864. So there are plenty of guys who are former military in the Civil War who were Democrats. And a lot of them became Republicans during the Civil War and then reverted back to Democrats, but some stayed Democrats all along.
At this point, many Americans were now terrified of another civil war and what they called the Mexicanization of American politics. And so, fearing another conflict, or at the very least mass civil disobedience,
no, not a donut shortage, we can't have that.
It was decided in the most Washington-esque move ever that this crisis would be solved by a commission. Said commission would have 7 Democrats and 7 Republicans, 3 from the House, 2 from the Senate, and 2 from the Supreme Court. And it would also have 1 non-partisan Supreme Court judge who would ultimately be the tiebreaker.
And surprise, the nonpartisan Supreme Court judge tended to be conservative because that's mostly who was on the court at that time. Or not conservative, but Republican.
Both parties did the unthinkable and they agreed on something. They agreed that said member would be Justice David Davis because he was seen as a fundamentally honourable man. But it was here that the Democrats had a fantastic idea. Let's win him over to our side by offering to make him a senator. A position which he accepted, but because he was said honourable man, he felt that this would sway his vote and so he resigned the commission. He was then replaced with another justice, this time a Republican because all of the remaining justices were, and after a series of partisan...
Right, so I mean the Democrats shot themselves in the foot. Neither side was playing fair here, right? You see a chance to win, you're going to use any advantage you have to try and take it. So the Democrats try to pull a fast one by offering this guy something that's going to get him on their side. So when he finally pulls himself out of it, the Republicans are like, you already tried to game the system, so now we're just going to game the system. And that's kind of what we're seeing today, isn't it? Where, oh, you're going to gerrymander your districts? Well, we're going to gerrymander our districts. Well, we only gerrymandered our districts because other people did it before them. Everybody blames the other side for the reason that they do things they shouldn't do.
Votes, Hayes won the election with 185 Electoral College votes to Tilden's 184. Importantly, it had been agreed beforehand that this commission's decision would be final. Unless, of course, both halves of Congress rejected it, but since only the House did, President Hayes it was. This decision looked like it could split the country, but it was here that Tilden accepted defeat. Not because he recognized that he lost the election, but because most of his fellow Democrats weren't willing to cross certain lines.
Right. And this is kind of what you saw with Al Gore in 2000. It's what you've seen in other situations where Richard Nixon in 1960, where you've got some questions, legit or not, about elections, and the person who is coming out on the losing end in the midst of those questions says, you know what, for the good of the country, let's just let this go. Let's move on. And that's what Tilden does.
He'd also done a terrible job of pushing his claim. You see, Tilden was, to use a technical term, loaded, and when his allies asked him to finance their preparations, he refused and instead kept quiet and basically waited to see if he would just be made president.
To Tilden's
Whereas
credit,
Hayes did not do this, and he was very clear that he had won and was going to be the next president, and anybody who disagreed was anti-democratic and probably smelled bad too. Tilden only became forceful after the commission had declared for Hayes, at which point it was too late because his backers had mostly calmed down. At least enough to put the guns away. Because whilst many Democrats and Southerners were angry with the outcome, they knew that another civil war was too awful to comprehend. Furthermore, given the slim majority that Republicans had won by and given that many Democrats saw Tilden as a weak candidate, they didn't feel the need to push too hard. Because they knew that they'd be guaranteed to win the next one. Spoiler alert, they did not.
And it was a super close election between Garfield and Winfield Scott Hancock, another Democrat who was a Civil War general. But yeah, the Republicans won.
There's a commonly held belief that says an informal agreement was made between the Democrats and the Republicans, known by some as the corrupt bargain of 1877, wherein the Democrats gave Hayes the presidency in return for him ending Reconstruction and withdrawing federal troops from the South. Now, he actually did do these things, but there's zero evidence of such an agreement ever being made.
I keep saying this. It did not matter. First of all, if Samuel Tilden had won the election and become president, he would have ended Reconstruction. By 1876, massive support for the end of Reconstruction in the United States. Grant was having a harder and harder time getting things done related to Reconstruction and fighting for civil rights in the South because people had just gotten tired of it. So it was ending either way. There's no bargain to have been made here.
Now, of course, none of them would have actually written this down. It's just simply the case that Hayes was a much more moderate Republican, and he believed that Grant and his party had been far too harsh on the former Confederacy. Also, had this deal existed, then the House of Representatives almost certainly wouldn't have continually refused to acknowledge Hayes' presidency. It even went so far as to pass a bill stating that Tilden was the actual winner of the 1876 election and that Hayes' presidency was illegitimate. Realistically, of course, this didn't do anything except for make them feel better about the situation, but either way, the election was over. And so, civil war, whilst closer than many would have imagined, was made more likely due to a lack of process for a contested election. But it was ultimately prevented by the culture of democracy that the vast majority of Americans and their representatives held dear.
And that's the thing, is that in the end, people realize, as tired as we are of Reconstruction, we are even more tired of the fact that we just went through a civil war that killed 750,000 of our citizens. We do not want to go down that road again, not even as passionately as we feel about an election. And I hope that's how people feel today as things are pretty heated.
So of course people were extremely angry. The vast majority of politicians on both sides recognised the horrors of the Civil War could never be revisited, and that for the sake of themselves in the United States, maintaining a stable form of government trumped all else. Cooler heads had prevailed. I hope you enjoyed this episode.
That was good. Of course, it was fast, and we're covering a lot there, but I think he did a pretty good job of presenting exactly how that all went down. And so were we close to a civil war? I mean, you could argue, well, there was talk of calling up militias, but it never got to that point. And there have been other times where there's been talk of things that never resulted in things. The difference with our actual Civil War was that in that case, the talk became actual action and led to those things. So there have been other opportunities that things could have gone down that road. That was good. Let me know what you think. If there's another video from this particular channel you'd like me to check out, let me know in the comment section below. And check out the link to the Scotland trip for July of 2026. Hope you can join us. It's going to be a lot of fun. Thanks for watching.